Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, for the last few years, Americans have watched with a certain degree of dismay and even horror as the United States Department of Justice, an institution that's long been revered by many Americans, and including myself, a former federal prosecutor, has been weaponized by the left to go after those whose views are deemed unacceptable and who have been deemed targets by political appointees in the Biden administration Justice Department because they've been perceived as a threat to their own political interests. From the text messages of illicit lovers Peter Strzok and Lisa Page at the FBI to the Crossfire Hurricane scandal to the current prosecution of Donald Trump, Americans have lost faith in the Department of Justice, and they want the political weaponization of DOJ to stop. Unfortunately, this weaponization has only gotten worse under this administration, as we've seen with the use of unnecessary force and the prosecution of peaceful protesters at abortion clinics, the investigation of Catholics based on their religious beliefs, and the attendance of traditional Latin Mass, and, of course, the labeling of concerned parents as domestic terrorists based solely on their decision to show up to a school board meeting and raise legitimate concerns about how their children are being taught and otherwise treated at school. My amendment would prohibit the Department of Justice from prosecuting any individual in contravention of the Justice Manual. Now, the Justice Manual is a Bible of sorts within the Department of Justice. It's the Department of Justice rule book for federal prosecutors. Now, the Justice Manual, section 9-27.260, is clear. It says as follows, quote, "Federal prosecutors and agents may never make a decision regarding an investigation or prosecution or select the timing of investigative steps or criminal charges for the purpose of affecting any election or for the purpose of giving an advantage or disadvantage to any candidate or political party." The prosecution of former President Donald Trump by the Department of Justice through Special Prosecutor Jack Smith would appear, at least outwardly, to violate these impermissible considerations they're not allowed to make, and is intended to give the sitting president, who is polling miserably with the American people, an unfair advantage this November. This is a clear violation of the Justice Manual, of its plain terms. That's exactly why my amendment would prohibit funding for these prosecutions based on impermissible considerations that violate the Department of Justice's own policy manual, not just for the prosecutions of former President Trump, but also all Americans. The American people want our federal law enforcement to get back to its mission, keeping America safe by taking violent criminals who are destroying our cities, our communities, and our families off the streets, instead of focusing on destroying the Biden administration's political opponents. They expect and demand more of the Department of Justice, and we should too. To that end, Mr. President, I move to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 4366 with my amendment, number 1623.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Utah, Mr. Lee, moves to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 4366 with an amendment numbered 1623.
Mr. President.
There shall be 2 minutes of debate equally divided.
Okay.
Mr. President.
The senator from Utah.
Mr. President, at the end of the day, the American people understand something's terribly wrong. They understand that when the Department of Justice is politically weaponized to prosecute again and again political opponents of this administration, including and especially the 45th President of the United States, a man who is the principal rival, the lead political opponent of the current president, something's terribly wrong. They're violating the Justice Manual. That's not right. This amendment would fix that, and I urge my colleagues to support it.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, the Lee Amendment is such good language, it's already in the law. The Justice Manual already establishes a standard with the virtually verbatim language in the Lee Amendment. Furthermore, the Justice's Manual reflects the express prohibitions against discrimination by law enforcement enacted by Congress in the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. It also reflects consistent holdings by the Supreme Court on due process and equal protection. The only time we believe this has been successfully implemented was during the Trump administration, when there was fear that they were going to weaponize the Department of Justice. And this standard, which is already in the law, at least discouraged many from participating in that exercise. The good news is this language is redundant and is unnecessary. The bad news is if we adopt it, we're going to stop the process of appropriating and avoiding closing government this evening. I urge my colleagues to vote no on the Lee Amendment.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent for an additional 15 seconds.
The senator has 30 seconds remaining.
Thank you. Mr. President, to the extent this is already law, fine. We shouldn't hesitate for a second in attaching a spending condition to this. Truth is, it's not part of law. It's part of the Justice Manual. We ought to make it a condition of the spending bill. As far as this causing a shutdown, this is going to take 10 minutes. We're going to have this vote with or without opposition to it. We might as well pass it now. What I didn't hear is any refutation of the fact that the Justice Department has been weaponized against the 45th president, President Biden's lead political opponent. That's wrong. I call for the ayes and nays.
Mr.
Is there
President,
sufficient
do you have
second?
any time remaining?
Time has expired. The question is on the motion.
Call for the ayes and nays.
I'm sorry that we're not focusing on areas where we could cut spending, like ships that don't work and the Navy doesn't want, the abominable situation of military housing. This is a missed opportunity. But the picture that is painted is wildly at variance with reality. You talk about dangerous. Alabama has a murder rate 3 times New York City. Texas is 50% higher. An unstable world? Well, unstable because a Republican minority has refused to be able to support our valiant allies in Ukraine that are fighting for our freedom and their lives. And it's still hung up. I find that appalling and embarrassing. And you should too. The world is actually more stable in terms of what the American has done. We have the strongest economy of any developed country, and that's a fact. Any independent expert will agree with that. Now, part of the problem here is that we don't want to appease the murderous Putin and the outrageous assault on our allies. Now, our economy has been downgraded because you've refused to stand up to a small minority of your members who have pursued policies that are destabilizing. And that's what they're talking about. They're not talking about the economic performance. They're talking about the inability of this Congress to deliver on its responsibilities because you have been held hostage by a small minority of your members. I don't think most of you actually believe in that. I don't think most of you want to sell out Ukraine. I don't think most of you really support that activity. I wait for you to break through, to be able to agree with that, and we can deal with some areas that we agree with. I've talked about military spending, waste in the agricultural sector, things that should be bipartisan. But dreaming up non-existing facts, denying reality, and catering to the most extreme members of your congressional folks isn't helping us. It's dividing us, it's making us weaker, and it doesn't have to be that way. I appreciate your efforts to try and focus on the debt. That's something that I appreciate and we can do something about. But living in this economic fantasy land doesn't advantage it. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his willingness to work on a bipartisan basis.